Hey, well, everybody, welcome to this exciting and really interesting session. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I am here at UNSW on Bedegal land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as acknowledge any Indigenous people who are on this call today, or for that matter, watching the video in the future. My name is Lyria Bennett Moses. I'm the Director of the Allens Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation here at UNSW in Sydney. So we are organising this event together with Creative Catalyst and the UNSW Law's Learning and Teaching Seminar Series. So basically what this is going to look like is about 40 minutes of a kind of in-conversation discussion between me and Paulina. And then that'll be followed by 20 minutes when everyone gets to say what they think, or we can end up in a bit of a discussion. It's a nice small group, which is actually really cool. So we can have a real conversation. So Paulina, I'm going to do a very short introduction here. The main thing about Paulina is she co-teaches with me in my course. That's it. But I teach a course on designing technology solutions for access to justice, which teaches law students basically how to come up with an app. And obviously they need to think about a problem creatively and then think about how to solve it creatively without closing things down, something lawyers are not generally very used to doing. So Paulina used to physically come into the classroom, complete with Play-Doh and bendy sticks and other things, and help them change their way of thinking. And it's been awesome when we've done that. This year we are going to do it all online. So it'll look a little bit different, but hopefully be equally awesome. In addition to that, Paulina also runs Creative Catalyst, and she has books, and I'm actually going to put a link to her latest book in the chat. So anyone who wants, enjoys what she has to say and wants to read more can do that. She's actually got a whole bunch of books. There's a book on Creativity Plus as well, which is the one I've used in the course, which is also great and just really good little mini exercises. But the best person to introduce Paulina is not, in fact, me. It is herself. So my first question, Paulina, is what do you do?
That is a very good question. So for most of my career, I worked for 20 years within a large corporate doing innovation, which got me interested and excited about creativity. And in 2012, I went back and did a Master's of Science in Creative Problem Solving and used that.
Hold on. Is anyone else? Wait. Sorry. Brief pause. Is anyone else having trouble with the sound? Okay, it's only my end. It's all good. Keep going.
Okay, but yes, do let us know if we do have problems and everything like that. That is good for us to know. Yes, so in 12, I went and did a Master's of Science in Creative Problem Solving and graduated in 2012. And for the last 4 years, I've been working for myself and actually teaching and training people in universities and in big corporates and in personal how to actually think more creatively. And as you said, I've written books, and this is my third book. So the Holy Bible, no, that's not upside down. Oh, yes, it is upside down. Creativity has many flaws. Yes, and it's a book about a concept that we're calling creative enlightenment. And really, it's about how to actually generate more creative moments, and gives you a lot of strategies and tools for more breakthrough-like thinking. So not just ideas, but more breakthrough-like thinking. So that's a little bit about what I do.
Excellent. And so obviously a lot of that is to do with creativity, which is, funnily enough, here for this event. How do you define creativity?
Oh, that is a great question, and I don't think I define it how most people define it. I think most people define it as having new ideas or interesting connections and out-of-the-box thinking. And we will talk a little bit more about why that is the common definition and even the accepted, I'd say, academic definition of what creative problem solving is or creativity is. And I think it's a little narrow. So I actually think about creativity more and what it can do. And I used to kind of define it as it's a way of reframing obstacles so they become opportunities. And I'll repeat that. It's a way of reframing obstacles so that they become opportunities. And I'd say up to the last 6 months, that's the way that I've actually looked at it. But I've actually kind of gone deeper since then. And really, fundamentally, creativity is imagination. And when we are sleeping, awake, we have 24/7 running our imagination. And I think ultimately that's what it is. And I think it's weird in some ways that we actually have quite definitions around it when it is something that is so innate that we talk about it like it's difficult to generate, etc. But really, if we acknowledge it, we are 24/7 creative beings that are constantly interpreting the world around us. Whether we're doing it consciously or unconsciously, we are creative making machines, and we use this to tell stories about ourselves and about our world. And I think if we actually went back to before we all had education, I think that if you look back almost to Greek times, I think we had a much more natural relationship with our creativity back then than we do today.
Wow. So if that's what creativity is, what is creative insight?
Creative insight is that kind of sense that you get, and it's bigger than, it can be an aha moment, but it's really when you realize something new, that you make a new connection that's actually quite powerful, that reframes the way that you're viewing things. And you know when that happens. It's an innate process. I don't have to explain it. It's when something and you kind of go, and you just see the world differently. Now, funnily enough, we tend to define creativity as what comes after that insight that's important. And I think that's incorrect. I think the insight is what really counts, because it's at that moment that our worldview, our perception has fundamentally changed. And it means that in our brain, a new connection has been made, and that there's some wiring going on there. There's some electricity going on there that is really starting to change the way that we think. And it's actually starting to change us neurologically and physiologically. So for me, the creative insight, or that moment of connection that you consciously are aware of, and that you kind of go, oh, that's how that works, or that's why I didn't understand that. For me, that is the really big creative moment that we tend not to focus on. We tend to like to focus on what comes next.
Okay, so heading back into sort of what we was going to do in this session, at university we often say, we teach students to think creatively and critically, and in fact use lots of other adverbs for what we say we're going to do to them. What is the difference between creative and critical thinking?
All right, as you can kind of guess, I don't necessarily distinguish that there is a difference. And in fact, I think that one of the challenges of the way that we actually, particularly in Western culture, look at things is we're very good at dissecting things, analyzing things, bucketing things, and grouping things. And one of the dangers of this thinking is that we actually put things in little boxes, and we start to actually emphasize their differences instead of actually realizing that many things have much more connection than we give them when we put them in silos. So I would like to think of creative thinking and critical thinking more as an energetic interplay. Almost like breathing. You breathe in, you breathe out, and you go kind of between the two. Or you can look at it more like a spectrum, an energetic spectrum of how you actually are interacting with the world, or what kind of processing power that you're pulling on your brain. Now, you will notice that when you're doing analytical work that you're actually not very skilled at, what you will notice is that you will get tired. And if you start to think about creativity more energetically, and that's how you experience it. So what I'm actually asking you in some ways is to stop asking me for definitions and kind of remember that you are a creative machine and you know this stuff already. But it's really important that you remember that you do know this stuff. And when you think about it energetically, when you're lifting an analytical load or trying to learn a new skill, it's hard, and you're often very clunky. And metaphorically, we'd say, well, you're in your left brain mode. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to work through the steps. And so that can be analytical stuff almost at its worst, and why we sometimes don't like doing analytical things. But the more skill that you get at anything, and it doesn't have to be creative problem solving activities, you start to actually notice that the energetic load starts to shift. It becomes easier for you to do it, and you actually become almost physically lighter as you go through it. Those are analytical moments as well, because you're still discriminating, you're still making choices, but you're doing it probably in a much more playful way. And for me then, it's acknowledging that there are many different ways of being analytical, that it can also be creative, and that you can move between those two states quite naturally, particularly when you're skilled. Now, we know from a bit of brain study by Roger Beatty, who I think is Penn State University, he talks about highly creative people. And so he's defined them whether or not they've by creative achievements, whether it's music, etc. I didn't read the detail of that. And he says that what they're doing is they're activating three parts of the brain at the once. And I think it's the executive, the salient, and I think it's the default network. But essentially what he's saying is they're converging and diverging at the same time. I think that's true of anybody who's highly skilled at something, that you're actually considering choices, making those choices, expanding on those, going back into those choices, and it's all quite natural. But I think what it does open up is some beautiful space that we don't necessarily talk about, that creative thinking and even critical thinking, they're very, at their highest level, they're very paradoxical. They're not one thing or the other. They're not one emotion or the other. They're not one form of cognition. They very much are alive, breathing. And as you play with ideas, you're physically moving between very much different emotional states and very much different cognitive states. And we do those naturally. And interestingly enough, we do know from brain science that when we're doing this, the load on the brain, so to speak, and that's a little bit clumsy way of talking about it, but it's actually very natural. It's a very untiring way of actually working. We actually can go for longer, much more energetically, because we're much more attuned. And what happens in the brain is that we're lighting up lots of different networks. And what the brain is doing is the brain is functioning beautifully, and it's like it's talking to one another, and networks are moving and information is flowing. It's almost like electricity, and that's how it's working. And at its highest level, you can move into a very transcended state where you can make all kinds of connections that you would not necessarily have conceived of at the kind of lower level of critical thinking. I think one of the challenges is that the way that we're trained, we pull ourselves down more often into this lower level critical thinking and not acknowledging enough that there is a bigger space that we can occupy even when doing tasks like writing contracts, because we're talking about law. I mean, at the end of the day, thinking is highly creative. Making decisions, problem solving is highly creative, and it can be a low level, or we can actually start to say we can think critically and creatively at the same time at a more higher level, in the sense of not more higher thoughts, but in the sense of using more of our brain power more naturally to work harder for us so that it's actually easier, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I'm going back to the what I just said about, we like to use these adverbs, right? Yeah. So we say we teach you how to think critically, or we teach you how to think creatively.
Yes.
So a two-part question now. Okay. What other words are useful? So are any of these adverbs useful at all?
Yes.
And second of all, I suppose, how do we think of it? So if you had to draw an image, right? Yes. Is there, are they sort of intersecting Venn diagrams? Is it, what is the best way to think of the interaction between all these different adverbial ways we say we think?
Yes, there is some benefits in actually being able to distinguish between certain ideas, and even actually considering creativity as a spectrum, which is a kind of, simple cognition or creative, critical thinking down here, and almost kind of the transcendent creative thinking over here. So I think thinking of them as spectrum and being able to delineate that there's various different energies along the spectrum is useful. I think where it's less useful is I think we get attached to concepts and we forget that there are other concepts, okay? So it's great to put things together, to bucket them, to silo them, and it's useful. We cannot do the technology, the technology that we've got around us needs that kind of segmentation, but we get very attached to how things are different. And we almost end up in this binary world where things are right or wrong, or that's part of that group and that's not part of that group. And that's where it becomes clunky. So we get attached to the fact that there's critical thinking and there's creative thinking, and there are those that are good creative thinkers and those are good critical thinkers. That's crap. That's where we start to actually do ourselves a great disservice, because we're actually defining people in ways and defining thinking in ways that's actually not even true, nor is it helpful, nor is it aspirational, and it's actually causing us to almost go against our true natures. So that's where I struggle with it. It's like, things can have names, things can have labels that can be useful, but things can be also have different names, different labels, different buckets, and actually have different relationships too. It's keeping both thoughts in mind and being able to discriminate between the two when it's useful. And it sounds really simple, but I don't think we get told enough that there are times when you don't necessarily have to always classify things into one or the other in order to work with it. But is it not kind of true what I'm saying?
It is. It is. Basically that my question was crap, but that's okay.
No, it absolutely wasn't, because I think it is the nature of the way that we do it. And I think that the higher that we get and the more educated that we get, the more we get really good at classification and at actually getting really beautiful distinctions between this word and that concept and this concept. And that's great. Just realize, though, that there are more than that. And it's also the unity of the concepts that is equally as great, and sometimes offers different insights, because it's the way that most of us are not looking at the challenge.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to neuroscience because you were talking a bit about that before as well. So what overall does that science tell us about creative thinking, and what makes it distinctive? Is it the blue lights in the brain when you look at the images? What when we're in that wonderful state where the ideas are flowing and making new connections? What is actually going on? Is there a physical neuron that's built? What happens?
Look, in this kind of, and I may have to refer to my notes, but there is probably 3 areas of the brain, and God knows if there's a neuroscience on the call is going to hate me because I can't even get the words quite right. There's the parietal lobe, the cingulate, I'll have to give it to you, lobe, but there's kind of three lobes that are working. But we could get into diagrams and all that kind of stuff. And I was just finishing a conversation with a neuroscience, and he actually said something that I think made more sense. Is stop distinguishing between this on and off. See how these dualities come up, or this circuit's working or that circuit's working. It's not like that. He's like, when you start to think more generatively, more areas of the brain light up and more areas of the brain makes connections. And I'm like, oh, that makes so much more sense. And again, then you're like, oh, that's intuitive. Like that would make sense. And the more deeply I'm thinking about something, the more I'm playing with it, the more parts of my brains are making association, the more neurons that are firing. And when a neuron fires, you get a circuit, you get a connection. So if you think about it that way, then you kind of go, right, it's less about which section, and stop looking for an area of the brain and more start thinking about it, that the more that you actually feed the brain to some degree, the more that the brain lights up, the more connections that get made, the more new things that you can actually make with that. Okay, I'm not getting sound.
Sorry, I forgot the mute thing. It's the classic Teams Zoom meeting problem. Okay, so why do we think of creative thinking as, if you like, a sort of mysterious light bulb, right? I mean, you've talked about the lights in the brain coming up in neuroscience, but it always sort of, when we tell stories of people's creativity in the past, this person invented this or that person did that, we tend to talk about it as, oh, they were having a bath and suddenly an idea, bam, into the brain, and this mystery moment and wonderful, hallelujah, creative thinking. Yep. Why do we do that? And is that a helpful sort of type of story to tell?
There's 2 things here. You touched on 2 things. Well, why do we think the way we do about creativity? And I'll answer that first. And then we're going to come back to and remind me incubation, because what you were talking about was an incubation moment where you get the moment in the bath. But I think it's really important to talk about why we think about creativity in the way that we do. So a thing that most people don't know is that the word creativity did not exist in the Oxford English Dictionary as late as 1933. Yeah. Okay, so it's really important that we know where concepts come from because it's an extremely modern concept. And what I'm going to tell you next actually informs the way that you think of creativity. So so the first person really to put it into the English language was a guy called Alfred Whitehouse. And he wrote a book called Process and Reality in 1927, and he spoke of creativity in very transcendent terms. If anyone knows Whitehouse's work, even I've had people with multiple PhDs go, I can't get through it. It is hard. So we've forgotten about Mr. Whitehouse, but we grabbed the word and used it. Now, what was happening post-World War II is also very interesting, and it is an American concept of creativity. These Americans, I can say it, are to blame for a lot of things. No, actually, in a lot of good ways, in some ways too. But they came out of the World War II very prosperous. And one of the things is that they started a consumption economy. And so what they had for the first time was employees that needed to consume their goods, as well as go into the shops. So they had so much that they needed to consume that we got the world of advertising. Now, the world of advertising is actually not that far from the Mad Men's of the world in the TV show, because some of the people who are responsible for our modern thoughts of creativity are those ad people. So a guy called Alex Osborne, who was the head of BBDO, and that's a show is based on BBDO. He's the O in that show. Was based out of Buffalo, went to the university, partnered with a guy called Sid Parnes, and together they started to actually do the science of creativity. And one of the reasons is they needed it for advertising. And one of the things that they learned was, geez, people without necessarily university education and women and people of different ethnic regions and stuff, all of them can actually do ideas. So in a sense, we did a good thing. We democratized creativity. However, what do ad people actually need? They need big ideas. Okay, so suddenly we had the big idea, brainstorming coming in, and there's nothing really wrong with this, but creativity is so much more than just a big idea or a headline or a snappy little ad. Okay, and so the way I like to think about it is it's almost like you've been eating McDonald's and no one's actually told you there's a really good 5-star French Michelin restaurant around the road. And if you don't know that, McDonald's is great. But once you know that there's actually better food options out there that are more nuanced and that are more interesting, that's when you get hungry for something more. So the modern construct of creativity has come from that. Now, the other side it's come from a guy called Guilford, who actually championed the study of creativity as well. And the reason why he did it was doing it out of fear. The Americans were losing the space race to the Russians. So it was a call for us to catch up. But notice it was a call in fear of us getting left behind. So we needed to learn how to educate people. Get this? Educate people how to be creativity. Now there's poor Whitehouse in 1927 invented this word all about transcendence. And lo and behold, we stole it from him and we used it for almost its most simplest purpose. And then we had this artificial divide where we had artistic creativity over here, which is just like poor starving artists. They never make money, you know, or they're tortured. And then we have this kind of business creativity over here, which is all about ideation, all about ideas. It is that, but it's also so much more. And so we have this beautiful sense of artistic creativity that loves questions, that really goes through the whole process, but we've divorced it from the business creativity. And if you've ever been called a creative, and I believe there was some on this call, if you go back to the 1940s, you were just an industrial designer, or you were a graphic designer, or you were an interior designer. You were not a creative. You did not have that title. But from the 50s onwards, thanks to the advertising industry, you became a creative or not a creative. And that's a problem as well, because we created some artificial divides. So those are some of the reasons why we think about creativity in the way that we do. And I think we've done ourselves a great disservice in the way that we've actually created this modern concept and not realized where it's come from. That was my rant. You mute? Yes?
Sorry, yes. So I suppose following on from that, where does that link to the light bulb idea, right? The light bulb moment. Is that because of that history that we sort of link it with that, or is that sort of different again?
I think it is bigger than that. I think we've always understood that it was creative insight. And if you go back even further, you can look at the Greeks thinking it was from the Muses. And then you actually in the Renaissance had another change in creativity where we actually said we're rational beings. It comes from us. It doesn't come from God. It's actually created inside of us. And then it went on to say that there are actually certain people who are better at insights than others. But I think what we've really come to understand is that there are moments where we need to actually almost drop the problem or stop crunching it in the problem, the analytical side of us, and actually just allow the brain a moment to rest and to have connections. The brain hates an unanswered question, so it will seek out opportunities. And incubation is a time when it will actually play with those and be able to offer them up to you in a novel way. But when you're kind of going through the analytical crunching, you're almost saying, I need it to come out and look like this. And the brain's kind of going, well, that's not the answer. So until you shut that side of you off, I can't work with you. And then once you kind of daydream or actually go for a walk or actually allow some space to come through, then the brain goes, hey, there's that answer. And it comes through usually in a very unexpected way. So we need to engineer more moments of incubation, more moments of quiet, more moments of letting the brain breathe and allow those connections to come in instead of always grinding it out in front of a desk or grinding it out in front of a computer and forcing us. Go on.
Okay. No, so this is leading it perfectly into my next question, which is what do we do to cultivate creative thinking? So if we want more of this, and I think most people want more of this because it tends to be where the good stuff comes from, or we want to help our students get more of this in various contexts. What do we do? In other words, what is there a sort of, can you teach someone to be a creative thinker?
Yes. Well, actually, I'll go back to you are a tremendous creative thinker. It's A, cultivating awareness of it, but 2, move. I cannot tell you enough how we need to move. And it's interestingly enough, we don't do it enough in the classroom. We don't do it enough at work. We actually get quite static. The more, this isn't a thing up here and then there's other stuff down here. We are a united being. Okay. And so we think with everything, we move with everything. So then the more that you move, the more that you actually go with the flow, the more that you pace, the more that you fidget, all of those things that we've been told are really bad, they're really, really, really good things to do. And they are forms of mini incubation. Because as you kind of fidget and kind of do this, yeah, you're allowing the brain to rest and relax and actually make some connections. So I think that more than anything else, if you can move, if you can walk, and you can also get outside. By the way, we've done some studies. Not all nature is equal. We're very fortunate for those of us near beaches. The ocean is probably the greatest source of creative energy. And I would suspect the reason is because the horizon is so endless that it really gets us into the space of we are no longer relevant and we are part of something bigger. And it allows that kind of transcendent moment to occur and a lot of integration to occur. But getting outside, even if it's just a walk to go get a drink of water, or as we were joking, doing that cup of tea thing where you kind of do that. Yeah, but you don't always have to be on your phone or talking to someone. Those moments are best when you actually can have a little bit of silence in your kind of, just let your brain actually do its own work in those times so that it can integrate and offer you insights. I got to tell you, if we actually had walking classrooms, if we could do that, I got to tell you, I think that we would have much smarter people much quicker and much more curious about the world and much more able to more easily integrate concepts.
Okay, so some people presumably do that better than others, right? Like you have my images of sort of Greek philosophers under trees or something, right? Whereas we put people in classrooms. Some cultures are more indoor, other cultures more outdoor. Are there cultures or countries or historical periods? Do people walk more in the Renaissance? Is that why it was more creative? Like, is there a historical, cultural mode in which this is, I'm not going to say become creative because you've already both put everyone's creative, but in which more creativity occurs?
Yes, there are some standouts. So look, the coffee shop culture is not necessarily in the 20th century, the 21st century. It's been around for a long time. So you have it in Turkey, etc. But the coffee culture is not so much about the coffee, but it's about meeting houses where people can actually have relaxed conversations. So you get that within the Greeks, you get that within the Turks, etc. And oftentimes it occurs during times of social unrest or social change. So coffee houses today are great places for creative thinking. So yes, whenever you have groups that are able to actually meet and that we actually have cultures that facilitate those kind of conversations and connections, we actually get a lot more creativity. Now, interestingly enough, there are also cultural differences. Japan and Germany, surprised or not surprised, are actually some of the most creative nations. Now, I don't remember exactly how they're ranked, but I will give you my 2 cents on why I know most people might be surprised and why I think that actually is the case. I think that creativity loves constraints. And I think both of those cultures are very good in many ways in constraining people, but are also very good at recognizing you have to give people an out. So particularly the Japanese culture know that, yes, you can have a very regulated culture, but that you need to have moments where people can actually escape those cultural bounds and have a bit of freedom. So again, it's just this not one thinking that you can have a lot of constraints and you can be in some ways quite regimented and you can be beautifully creative at the same time in a way that we all culturally recognize. There's another thing in Western culture, something some of you may not know or know, genetically we are similar. We are so freaking similar no matter what, like color you are or whatever. We are genetically the most similar species on the planet. But culturally, we are not. And in our brains, neurologically, we are not. We make changes to our brains due to our culture. And Western culture puts a high premium on processing, analytics, and language, because that's what you need to actually do that. Mathematics is a form of language. We give up facial recognition in return for that. Whereas other cultures are actually have less emphasis on the processing and the writing and the reading and have more emphasis on connections and keep that facial recognition higher. And I would suppose that those cultures that do, and this is a suppose, probably have less mental illness because they are more focused on something that's incredibly important, which is the connection between one another. And I do think we tend to actually divorce that a little bit for the sake of education and processing and reading, which we put such a high premium on in Western cultures. And again, it's not one or the other, it's about both, but understanding that we in Western cultures have actually changed our brain to adapt to a cultural way of thinking.
COVID, I was thinking when you were talking about constraints, people have had obviously a lot of constraints in some cities, not able to hang out with people or as often, more time at home rather than workplaces. So many constraints. Good kind of constraints for creativity or bad?
It actually depends on your resilience of the person, I would say. I would hope that it would be good, but I think it's be unfair and untrue to actually say that. And I don't know, to be fair, how I would have coped with Melvin, who's actually, I think, like in a 6 or 9 month stint. But what it can do, if you've got a lot of personal resilience and emotional resilience, you will find ways to cope. And you will actually force yourself into new spaces, and it will be a creative resurgence. And certainly I personally have experienced a creative resurgence during the worst of it when we were locked at home together. And yeah, we're not used to spending time together. And I must admit, we had to shift our thinking, and I actually did some deep creative work during that time. But you really do have to have emotional resilience, and you do actually have to have a network. We cannot deny we are social beings. We need other people. We need humans. We don't always have to be in the same room. We can be introverted, but we still need deep connections, and we still need meaning from our lives, and we get those from one another. So we don't get those from a purely intellectual life. So being able to have a connection of some sort is extraordinarily important. And I do think that one of the reasons why we have increases in mental illness is because we are decreasing the amount of connections that we have culturally. Never before in time could you spend a whole day and never necessarily have a conversation with anyone. You can't do that in most other cultures, but we can lock ourselves up in our apartment, flip on the Netflix, and not say a word. That's a worry.
Okay, so I thought we might move now to the next phase. So we kept this event deliberately small because we wanted this to not just be like a presentation or a speech. We wanted it to be a conversation. So this is really a chance for anyone who's on this call, and feel free to unmute yourselves and speak what you thought, what you think about creativity. Does this accord with your understanding of what it is in your own life, or how you might teach it if you teach students these sort of skills? Did you have any questions that any of that raised? Anything at all? Comments, questions, thoughts, conversation starters?
And whoever speaks first, if they dominate the conversation, that's what happens. So if you're curious and dying, I would jump in. Radio silence. No.
Adriana, did you want to say something? Yes.
Oh, yay. We got a hug. I see little. Yes, cool. Awesome. Go for it.
There we go. There we go. Can you hear me? You good?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic. Yes. Hello from Japan. The restricted, your restricted neighbors. It is. I just wanted to say I've been here now for 21 years.
Oh, wow.
It's a very long time, of which I've been teaching for 18, higher education. And it is a challenge. It's a real challenge to try and break through those boundaries, and especially institutional boundaries are very, very strict when it comes to getting any kind of creative processes in the classroom. And I have been many times labeled a subversive teacher for doing so, but it is contagious. And I think this is something that is important about both creative thinking and critical thinking. I'm a historian and a sociologist, and teaching people whose first language is not English has its particular set of challenges. And it's, you know, as you were saying, Paulina, it's this spectrum of interactivity that we need to understand in order for this to be efficient, and for us to be able to be productive and include in that productivity our students. It's just understanding that concept. Without that, we cannot transform anything. We cannot spread the message. We cannot help people find their own answers, or have their light bulb moments, or have any kind of transition to a better understanding of who they are and how to solve their problems. And there's something you reminded me of Guildford, actually. I haven't read in a very long time, and that was like, you know, master's students, a long time ago. And it's the sensitivity towards creative solutions that he talks about. And it's something that I found that this year, with all the challenges we have and all the limitations we have, it's that sensitivity that is so challenged. we have become less and less sensitive to the need to approach others and network and find those solutions at the community level, because we are stuck in this rusty attitude of survival and getting the job done or getting the meeting done. So I wanted to hear what's your views, and my colleagues here as well, about this restrictions when it comes to how much we place ourselves behind those boundaries. Sometimes it is cultural, sometimes it's institutional, sometimes it is professional. But I think this year we are seeing a lot more about those self-restrictions and how we can be more efficient and how we can maybe see them a little bit before they take over. Yeah, before those restrictions actually push us down for good. How can we identify them and just stop that and become a little bit more efficient and aware?
Yeah. Look, I think you're right. And I think if you look at the word culture, it actually has the word cult in it. And I think that is for a reason, in the sense that I think that there is a cult of culture. And so it's often very hard to actually see that cult, so to speak, or to see that these rules, these ways of interacting, these codes of, codes of behavior are not necessarily stuff that we have to abide by. And that we can afford to sometimes take a step back and actually say what actually serves us and what actually doesn't, and maybe to be more aware of it. And certainly in this culture, we have a code of productivity, of time is money. It actually isn't. That's a metaphor. And the sense of actually always doing something, actually having output, having things to actually show for it, and not appreciating that doing nothing and staring at the ceiling sometimes is actually equally as important, if not even more important, but we don't recognize those as creative moments. So I think it's more about actually thinking more deeply about the things that actually work for you and don't work for you, and challenging whether or not they are codes that we have to abide by. I'm not saying that there are not codes out there that we do have to abide by. I mean, last I checked, we got to wear clothes and all that kind of stuff in certain meetings, but that's all the norm. But really kind of questioning some of those things and taking almost a childlike or naive view of the culture or the world around us, and actually just questioning what works for us. And the very simple thing that I would actually say is look out for things like should. Every time you say, oh, I really should do that, you're actually saying, I don't want to do that. That is actually against what I want to actually do. And there are certain things that you should do that you don't want to do, like maybe you have to do the dishes for your partner, but then don't look at it as, oh, I have to do that. Look at it as, this is a gift that I can bring. And then it becomes a choice. So should is often a great signifier that the situation or the outcome or whatever the activity that you're doing is being framed in a way that's not serving you, and that some kind of light that you need to actually function fully has been dimmed. So it's a really easy signifier that something there has gone wrong, and there's an opportunity there to reframe it. Because what I'm not suggesting is that you actually throw out all conventions. What I'm actually suggesting is be aware of the conventions, and then you can take opportunities on how you actually think about them, how you see them, how you frame them to actually help you. And the Holy Bible is about poking holes in our thinking. Really, it's about reframing. It's so many different concepts in my book about how to actually reframe things so that it serves you and you are not actually at mercy of it. So I hope that answered your question.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, we've got two questions coming up, one in the chat, but before that, Aruna.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for that great session. So I have a couple of questions. One of them is about those empty moments for the brain, which you mentioned about. So often we find that children zone out, like say while playing or while reading something. So is it that something that they naturally do, and then do we need to encourage that aspect of a child?
Yes, I would say it's something that they naturally do. And yes, I would say that we do encourage it. Yes. And I know that's kind of counterintuitive to a lot of teaching, but yes, it's really healthy. It's where integration is actually occurring, integration in the brain. It's where the learning occurs, and where you actually, if you allow enough of it, you'll make new connections, novel connections that will take you even deeper. And what most people don't realize is that that kind of dreamy sense is actually more our default mode. We've trained ourselves out of it. And it's almost like, and it's a metaphor, if you've got the left brain, which is the analytical, and the right brain, which is the dreamy side, these two are at war. And the right brain wins more often than we think, because when we drift off into looking out the window, we tend not to acknowledge it or even realize that we're doing it. And there's lots of new studies that are actually suggesting that we may be in that space more often than we even think of, and that we may be actually filling in reality. That I may have tuned out for this conversation and imagined that I talked all the way through it or something like that. But yeah, there may be longer lapses. So it's really quite natural behavior. And culturally, within Western culture, we actually say, oh, he's a dreamer, she's a dreamer, they got their heads in the clouds. We say mean things about them, but I think we should be encouraging more of them. And it's about a rebalancing. We're so much on this side of actually pay attention, listen, learn, be alert. We've really kind of walked away from the other side. And we do kind of have a sense, at least, you know, in the Western culture, you should have mindfulness and stuff. But even that, I think we haven't completely well understood, because there can be a mindfulness that is an absence of thinking. But there is also a mindfulness that can actually be present and also thinking and active, but not necessarily judging. It's not trying to create something out of the moment, but actually being fully embodied in the moment. I know personally, when I teach a lot of creative thinking classes, I will find people that will tune out, that will actually kind of almost go quiet. They may actually play a little bit with their, you know, fingers or with any toys that I provided. And I do that so that they actually move. But I always find at the end that those are the people who have absorbed the most and are so fully there, but on another level. So I think I've learned not to judge attentiveness or looking at me and nodding as a form of understanding, and to realize that these people who are a little bit quieter, almost dreamier, or seemingly not interested, are processing quite deeply and using the freedom I'm giving them to actually have a much deeper conversation. And there you will see that those people will have a transformation, a personal transformation that is much deeper than anyone else in the class. So it's a very long way of answering that I fundamentally believe we don't do enough of this. We don't give everyone space to actually have that, and we're too quick to judge and to bring people back to attention when they were actually potentially solving the problems of the world. I mean, Einstein did not come up with a theory of relativity by crunching it out in his desk. I'll just turn the light back on. It was actually in a dreaming moment, and that's why they're so important.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. That is really wonderful. An additional question. You mentioned about this radiant thinking. Wherein the more deeply you think, more neurons get fired up and more parts of your brain gets used. So, I mean, related to this question and my earlier question, so the more we like allow like the brain to zone out, so is that what leads to this development of more neural, maybe like newer neural paths?
It can do. It's actually yes, not always necessarily, but it's actually, if we actually kind of play with it. So sometimes it will actually occur for ourselves. So in incubation, so it will actually just start to make patterns, but it works harder for us. And I think it's more about letting it work harder for you, because your mind can wander aimlessly and you can do almost nothing with it. But oftentimes when you actually suggest to the mind that there are things that you're interested in, or there are challenges that you would like solved, and you almost pose that, well, not almost, if you pose that to your brain in a question and then let it ponder on that, it will actually use those moments of supposedly just looking at the ceiling and doing nothing. It will use those moments then quite deliberately to explore some of those ideas. So that's why it's actually pays to actually be paying some energy and attention to where you want to go. Because we're not blank slates. We do have dreams, ambitions, and visions, and paying attention and feeding those with emotion. And then in those quieter moments, the brain will actually start to noodle on some of those and actually start to use that time very productively to offer you new and interesting insights that may lead to solutions. So there used to be that thing called The Secret, which was, it was crap. But it had some good ideas, like a lot of things. And it used to suggest that if you visualize something, it will come. No, it won't. If you visualize something, it may or may not come. But let's face it, I'm never going to be a professional basketball player, no matter how long I visualize it. That's not the thing. But what it is saying is that if you actually feed the brain with attitudes, imagery, emotion, and curiosity, what it will do is your brain will become a seeking missile, and it will seek to actually bring some of those things to reality, because the brain does not distinguish between what is vividly imagined and what is real. It doesn't. Neurologically, it does not distinguish between what is vividly imagined and what is real. And that's why it pays to be a dreamer and to have dreams that maybe you don't even have any idea how you could resolve them, because the brain will say, but that's important to you. I'll find and offer you insights that may help you get it, but it'll probably offer it to you in an unexpected and interesting way. And what I like to say is when you're in those kind of moments, you find that the world works very serendipitously. You find that you actually make the connection or find the person or see the article or have that moment where it seems like the universe is offering you gifts. I'm pretty sure the universe doesn't really care about any of us, and it's not in the business of offering us gifts. However, if the brain is attuned to those moments and you've actually said some of these things are important, it will make you more aware of these moments and not let them have you casually pass them by. And it will wake you up and make you more sensitive to those connections so that you make them so that you can achieve some of the outcomes that you want.
Thanks a lot. That was really helpful.
Paulina, that also reminded me of, I used to always do when I was a math student, I used to always do assignments just before bed, and then I'd dream solving them and wake up in the morning and know the solution. But it's exactly that, right? You're sort of setting yourself up, you're putting the problem in your head so that, you know, at the right moment, which for me, for some reason, was in the middle of the night, it worked. So
exactly. But you see, there is creative processing power in dreams, but we tend to turn that off. And other cultures actually don't distinguish such a hard line between awake and dreaming. They're just different modes of being, and that sometimes they bleed into one another, and you can have that. And so it's, again, it's not all work is done in front of a notebook or a computer, or it can be done even in our sleep. You just set it up with the right question. Absolutely.
Excellent. All right, so we've got a question from Gloria. Gloria's microphone doesn't work, but here is her question. Someone in the advertising industry once commented, creativity is something you are born with. It's something you either have or don't. That's why some could come up with very creative ideas that sell, whereas others only come up with lame or uninteresting ones. What's your take on that?
My take is that is a person being snobby about their own industry and valuing themselves far too highly. It's actually quite rude. No, it is rude. It's just really rude to actually even say that your ideas are lame, and there is an implication that my ideas as a creative person who is saying this are better. Ideas are not about egos, and they're not about being owned. I mean, the beauty of the copyright system, correct me if I'm wrong, is you really can't own intellectual ideas. You can own trademarks and all that kind of stuff, but ideas are free. They always should be. And for the person to actually think that it's a lame idea is lame themselves, because there's often something really interesting in lame ideas if you have fun with them and you stop worrying about actually impressing others and look at the beauty of the idea for what it is, with the naivete again, to see something interesting there and new connections. Whether all advertising is effective? No, that's true. There are probably good ads and bad ads. There are people who can write good ads and people who are not so good at advertising. It's one skill. It's just one talent. And if any of us works at it with interest and aptitude, we will be good, but we will be ranked. Some of us will be better and more effective than others. But there are vastly more ways of expressing our creativity and actually playing with ideas and playing with questions than just being an advertising person. It's just one route, and it's a worthy route. But please don't ever get caught by that. And if someone actually tells you they have lame ideas, I have to say, look real hard at them. It takes nothing to judge. It takes a lot to actually have fun with an idea and learn how to defer judgment. We haven't talked about it today, but deferring judgment is one of the greatest creative traits that you can have. And you're deferring judgment of yourself to some degree and just actually being in the moment.
And that's your biggest contribution, I think, to the law students when you come into my class, because they're used to judging everything and not used to deferring it. But speaking of lawyers, the next question's from Min.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure how should I put my question. It seems that some scientists or scholars, or whatever we want to call them, they do believe in novel idea. They say creativity means bending, breaking, and blending different ideas or information. And if that is true, why it seems in our universities and educating students, we are rewarding specialization, we are narrowing down or making a framework for them that you should think in this area. We are not giving them an opportunity to look at the issues from other perspectives, like from other fields, like why we don't teach them to think about legal issues from psychology lenses.
I mean, I'm going to jump in on that one because
Go
I've
for
actually given a talk on this. I think we do it far younger than university. Already when kids are at high school, they're told this is maths class, this is English class, this is science class. They start being told you have to do all of it. You're going to be the sort of science person, you're going to do these subjects, you're the humanities person, you go do those subjects. And we start putting thought and thinking in all these crazy boxes. And then we wonder, like, you know, why can't we solve climate change? It's because some people are looking at it from a very scientific perspective. Other people are seeing it as a political problem, right? That there's a politics issue here. Others are seeing it as an engineering issue and solving some particular engineering problem and so forth. So we're not good anymore because we do this sort of carving up, that we cease being able to think of a problem and not instantly go into a disciplinary mode, right? Whereas in fact, most problems cannot be solved purely within one discipline. There are some that can.
Yep.
There are some purely legal problems, purely mathematical problems and so forth. But most real world problems that we have to solve require you to understand the science and the politics and the engineering and the law. And I'm leaving it out, but psychology. And we can then come back and then we say, oh, let's create interdisciplinarity, right? After we've made you think along these narrow stages, now come into this group. And that can work to some extent. But my solution is that what we actually need is, well, certainly in tertiary education, to have, you know, degrees in that aren't bound. We can have disciplinary degrees still. I'm not going to ban law or ban science, but I think we also need to have degrees that just set up problems and encourage students to go beyond the disciplines. As an experiment, let's see what happens. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Paulina.
Oh, I totally agree. I think that as the world's gotten more complicated, as we've gotten more technology, etc., we need more specializations. I mean, not everybody can afford to be an engineer, a plumber, a lawyer, you know, a coder. And so, but as we actually do deep specialization, we've lost that kind of sense of being able to work across the spectrum as well and to have a little bit of knowledge anymore. There's really no true Leonardo da Vinci anymore, who actually was so, you know, able to actually be an artist, engineer and stuff like that. It's almost physically not possible for us to actually do anymore. So hence why we do deep specialization. So really all I can say is get your deep specialization degree, because it is important, and actually as far as in many respects getting that money, so to speak, or getting that future. But you personally don't take the interdisciplinary out of it. Go curious, go wild, go wander, go make connections, because I think the real breakthroughs will come from the deep thinkers in one area coming together with deep thinkers in other areas and making those connections. Things are far too complicated to look at it from one lens. We are going to have to unite and have multiple lenses for things like climate change. It is political. It is humanistic. It's the way that we behave. It is psychology. It is law. It is all of those things. So we are going to have to solve the world's problems thinking differently then. And I think it's an Einstein quote, you know, you don't actually solve problems with the same thinking that you use that created it.
I like
there
that.
You go.
Nicholas.
Hi, thanks, guys. I'm with the School of Arts and Media at UNSW, and I teach advertising and creative advertising.
Oh, I'm dead. I should check my
No, very, very interesting. I think the question I have really is, you know, all the psychology on creativity and the study that was done in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the writing there. You know, a lot of the conclusions seem to be that you do need to fill your head with the subject material before you can kind of break it or change it or transcend it. And one of the things that really concerns me is that with economic rationalism in all forms of life, including academia, sadly, there seems to be less room for taking risks, making mistakes. Mistakes don't seem to be part of research anymore. Research is a done deal that gets funded by the government. I just wondered if you have any sort of comments around what seems to be a more restrictive economic rationalism that structures much of the areas that you talk about and going and being creative in, and what we do about that, or whether we can do anything about that.
Yeah, I think we can. I appreciate it's not easy, but I appreciate even being on these phone calls and talking a little bit differently about interdisciplinary thinking and not necessarily being so rigid in our creativity or rigid in classifications, and being more aware that, yes, we can classify things quite well, but we can also connect things quite well, and that they're both creative skills and that both are complementary. And I think it's almost, particularly in Western culture, we tend to veer towards one thing or another, or we tend to do a lot of duality type thinking. It's black or it's white, it's right or it's wrong, yes or it's no, which leads us down to this kind of economic rationalization, which, yeah, you have decisions being made without understanding the unintended consequences. And you're thinking too simply, well, if we shed staff, we'll save money. But yes, there will be unintended consequences about what you can offer and how you will actually impact the rest of the people and what you can deliver. So I'm hopeful that if those of us can start championing a different type of thinking, a more less binary, more interdisciplinary, more holistic thinking, a more paradoxical thinking, and realizing that it's not just moments for deep creativity, but it should exist more in our everyday lives, that this will actually help. And I do think that the state of where we're in is going to force this change. And because the kind of thinking and the structures that we're using right now have only gotten us so far. And they've gotten tremendous, results in many ways, but it's had tremendous unintended consequences. And I think that we actually have to have a redress in how we look at things. So, I mean, I'm hopeful in my work that we can actually start to pioneer some of this stuff. I mean, I'm going to actually, because academia is an important place where ideas get moved, we're going to try to test ideas like creative enlightenment, which is a more transcendent form of thinking that you can solve problems in. It's not just for bathing in the spiritual life of oneness. It can actually do things in it, like solve big problems, and you can actually start to make big connections. And that if a group of you in interdisciplinary with knowledge are coming together and having more transcendent like thinking, and that we're actually not necessarily operating just by talking or just by exchanging ideas, but almost that interconnectiveness that you get when you almost know someone else's thoughts and you're able to have those connections, and we physically know that that can occur. Championing and pioneering those kind of ideas, even through academia, hopefully, to actually hope that they get a broader audience, because that's my hypothesis, is the way that things are going to be changed. And it's also, I think, a much more rewarding way for us to operate and live and actually earn a living in. So I may be dreaming, but I've actually said that I am a dreamer and that I do subscribe to dreaming. And I think unless you have radical big dreams, you have no chance of actually changing the world. I would rather actually dream and fail, or dream and only get so far and let someone else pick up the baton and go with it, than to not dream at all. So I hope that helps. I'd be interested in your thoughts in response.
I think the mindset's absolutely right. I think the problem is that when you spend so much time gaining knowledge in a particular area, and it does take so long because of specialization now, and maintaining that ability to, or that youthful view of seeing the world in ways other than your discipline, it feels like that's getting harder. And I don't mean to be pessimistic. I mean, I believe in everything you're saying, and I try to champion it in my students and so on and so forth. But I just, it feels like that the world is closing in a little bit. How do we break that? Because I think it's important.
It really is important. And for you, it's kind of like, unless you deeply embody that, you won't be able to easily break those conventions with your students and stuff. And this is going to sound really simple and almost kind of stupid in some ways, but if you're kind of getting those moments, and we all do, where you kind of feel like it's closing in on you, or it's, go outside. Like, it's the simplest thing. Spend a moment looking up at the stars, and just remember that we are just small little cogs in a very, very, very vast world. And that is actually the opening. It's like if you're opening up a doorway, it's the little first crack that can actually remind us that, there is something that's actually bigger than ourselves, and there's something more emotive and more transcendent than ourselves. And I'm not talking about a huge transcendent moment. I'm actually just realizing that that kind of dialogue and that kind of inner stuff that we cultivate so well is just one aspect of ourselves, and there is a more integrated self that actually doesn't necessarily see such harsh boundaries between it and everything else, and doesn't necessarily even feel necessarily so blocked in or so black and white. So yeah, I can't champion enough the ability to actually walk, move, dance, drink, a glass of wine, a beer. They actually help us to slip. Go outside, spend the morning looking up at a sunset, cultivate a pet. All of those smaller things added up actually can make great difference in your own well-being and your own centering. And once you actually have that, then it's actually much easier to take people on the journey, because people crave these kind of moments, and people crave people who think like this. They will lean into you, they will find you, they will feed that energy, and it becomes quite self-fulfilling, but it almost needs to come from within first. And the best way to embody it really is movement, and movement in the outdoors.
I'm going to use my chair's prerogative, and we have to finish up anyway because we're just after 6. But one thing I always do with students is step back from that academic thing of, here's a litany of my successes. If everyone's CVs is everything they did get published, it's everything they did achieve, it's the prizes they did win, it's never the ones they didn't, it's never the studies that went nowhere, it's never the things still sitting in my bottom drawer that I never managed to, complete or publish or whatever. I always encourage, particularly at the PhD level, which is where they start to get really nervous, these are the things that happen. These are my worst reviews. These are the people who, thought what I did was crap, and maybe it was crap because maybe that particular thing I did was an idea that wasn't such a good one at the end of the day. But I think we need to be more whole people. I think part of what we do, and academia forces it on us to some extent, is we pretend this cycle of success when we all have moments of being stumped, of not having the exciting flares, or of having them that turn out to go nowhere. And I think the more we see ourselves as researchers, as people, in a broader light, that the more we can help others learn to do the same.
I agree, and I just quickly, because I know you're finishing up, but about 5 years ago I had a guest lecture from on the client side in advertising, and he came in and basically talked about his mistakes for an hour. Brilliant. And the way that the students sat forward and listened. What, really? Mistakes? It was fascinating, because you're right. I mean, you have to be very conscious of standing up and modeling a behavior they currently feel is unattainable. And I think you're talking about, and that's what I mean by trial and mistakes, right? It's such a big part of creativity, but it kind of gets lost because it's not efficient. Yes. But anyway, I won't take up more of your time. Thank you. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
I will say one thing. Yes, I love how it's not efficient. It so freaking is efficient. That is the joke. But it's the paradox of these things. So anyway, cool. And if you want to continue this conversation with any of me, you guys, my website is my name or whatever, my emails. By all means, please feel free to reach out. These have been fascinating conversations, and we've got to wrap it up. But yes, I'm prepared to take it offline for anyone else who would like to. Cool. Have I lost everybody, or I think I've frozen. Lyria. Cool. Can I hear you? No. At the very end of the phone call, we've got a freeze. Well, we made it for an hour and a half. Yes, or an hour. How long did we make it? Anyway, thank you. Please share this link later. Yes, if possible, can we change recording? So I seem to have lost Lyria on my end. I have no idea whether this babble is actually